Hey guys, welcome to another freeform video, and today, if it wasn't apparent by the thumbnail, I'm going to be reading some hot takes, or I guess it's debatable if you actually think those are hot takes, because I feel like nowadays everything that is a hot take is more just a sensible opinion. In fact, someone actually pointed that out in the comments. I wanted to do something like this because my channel is founded on the basis of discussion and, proposing different perspectives on the game, whether or not they're factually well thought out, or if they're just some random person bitching and moaning about the game. And I mean, that is me in a nutshell. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to do because most of my videos are me talking to you guys about something that's been on my mind, and not so much me receiving information or receiving feedback or thoughts on something and then forming a video around that. So today will be more of like a podcast type topic, just like I've done for my other freeform videos. So you can minimize the video if you want. Nothing interesting happens on screen. I actually had no idea what I wanted to put on screen, so I settled for just posting some gameplay content if you want to watch. Before we go any further though, I want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Goat Games' Bloodline Heroes of Lithus. Bloodline's a hero collector fantasy RPG with a 3D art style in which you can build your kingdom through pairing up bloodlines together, or in other words, making babies. Their main gameplay mechanic is the hybrid system, in which you can customize your champions through its unique marriage system to create over 800 different new hybrids between species such as elves, demons, demigods, orcs, dwarves, lycans, dragonborn, and more. Offspring not only inherit their talents and traits, but also their unique appearances passed down from each family tree so you can mix and match the best of each side. To celebrate this coming Halloween, they're releasing a new vampire clan known as the Accursed, comprising champions who deal huge amounts of damage and sustain in fights, not too different from the Darkins in League, Aatrox and Rost, and by participating in the Halloween event starting October 27, you can get an Accursed champion for free on the 7th day. It's free to play for both Android and iOS, so if you're interested in trying out a new mobile game, then use the QR code on screen or click the link in the description below and you get a special starter pack worth $20 featuring 10 energy potions, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds, as well as the aforementioned champion. Thanks again to Go Games for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's go back to some hot takes. I'm going to be picking 5 because I don't want this video to be very long, and you know me, I tend to ramble a lot. So what we'll do is, if you enjoy this video and depending on how well it does, you can feel free to leave some of your own hot takes or unpopular opinions in the comments, and we'll do a part 2. I might make this a serialized thing. We might do a part 2, part 3, part 4. It just once again depends on how well the video does. Not saying that I'm too concerned with views, but ultimately I'd like to be consistent with how each video performs, and I think that's about it. So I picked 5 for today, and this is going to be the first one. So this is from Alexander Martinez. I think mythic items are terrible for the game, and it was better when you weren't limited to a couple of first items. If they really needed the mythic passive stats, I think putting that on the rune system would be better. It's an interesting thought. At first, when I saw the mythic items changes, I thought that they were going to be very groundbreaking, right? I thought it was going to reinvent the meta and provide a lot of healthy first item choices for many champions who didn't have them initially, especially for top laners. Since I'm a top laner, it was difficult playing champions who couldn't make good use of either Trinity Force first item or Black Cleaver, since those were really the only 2 gold deficient items that could actually provide you with enough combat stats to remain competitive in the early to mid game. You couldn't really build, let's say, Titanic Hydra, or you couldn't go Ravenous Hydra. There just wasn't a whole lot of options, but then they introduced Gore Drinker, Divine Sunder, Stride Breaker, a lot of very interesting items for champions, and I think that applies to many others, like we have Eclipse, Dustblade, and Prowler's Claw. The assassin items have been rather underwhelming throughout the history of Mythics, which have been now I think almost 3 years now, right? No, it came out in season 11, so it's about 2. The assassin items may have been underwhelming. The mage items, they've had their cycles, they've had their up and downs. There was, Liandry's dominating the meta. Then there was Everfrost. Everfrost was a big one. We had Riftmaker, which was always a pocket item because not everyone built it. And I think there was also Crown of the Shattered Queen. There were some good functions for mythic items because most mythic items were actives, or they had a playstyle-centric passive that determined how the champion was supposed to play. Thing is, there's a very big distinction between mythic items and legendaries, in that mythics, as I just said a few seconds ago, determine what the champion's playstyle will be going forward, and if a champion doesn't conform to any one of the mythics, I can think of a few off the top of my head. Let's say Master Yi doesn't really benefit too much from mythics. I know Kraken Slayer is pretty good, but I've seen many Master Yis just not build it entirely. Then there's also, who else is another champion that doesn't build a mythic? Okay, maybe there aren't that many, but you get what I mean. There's a few outliers when it comes to champions who don't want to build a mythic item until, let's say, 2nd or 3rd or 4th, and they kind of have to, otherwise they'll be missing out on the mythic item passives. But how exactly will we convert that into a rune system? I suppose rather than giving us flat stats, like you know how there's the adaptive force, 10% attack speed, 8% ability haste, and then there's the armor magic resist attack damage, and then there's the defensive rune, like the free stats at the bottom. Maybe we can tailor that to where it would be providing mythic passive stats, like you would say, after purchasing a finished item, whether it be legendary or mythic, that would provide that stat. So instead of having to opt for, say, a good example would be Divine Sunder. One of the reasons why Sunder was so overpowered was not necessarily the Spellblade. The Spellblade component was very strong, but it was also, prior to the nerf, 5% armor and magic penetration with every subsequent mythic purchase, and that would mean you would get 20%, which was insane, further amplifying the effects of the Spellblade HP healing, max HP thing, whatever it was called. So you would have items that, even though they were pretty good, people wanted or didn't want it to buy it because of the mythic passive. For example, people went after Dustblade because of the ability haste, or people went after Prowlers. Prowlers was a good one because if you built a lot of assassin items plus Prowlers, some people would have 100 flat armor penetration and be doing true damage to squishies. That would be a good way to actually go about it, I think, because while mythic items have centralized the MO of every champion in terms of how they want to build and progress through every individual match, sometimes the meta would revolve so much around a specific item. Like a mythic, we had the Goredrinker meta, we had the Sunfire meta, we had the Everfrost meta, we had the, what else is it? You know, every mythic item at a certain point has been dominant for a good month or two. And we didn't really see that happen too much in previous seasons. There might have been one or two items, like we had the Ardent Censer meta, Banner of Command, things like that, but it wasn't as pervasive and as frequent as it is now. So I'd somewhat agree with you in that mythic items brought their own pros and cons. In the long run, it was better for the game, since many champions have had their quality of life improved in that sense. But yeah, that would actually be a pretty interesting suggestion to move the mythic passive stats into runes. But that also makes it difficult to balance because everyone's going to prioritize a select group of stats, and that can devolve into its own set of problems. Next hot take is going to be from Kuma. The item options are really limited. Almost every game I see, I build the same items. It would be fun if they had double the amount of items. This one overlaps somewhat with the previous one, but the one in particular that I wanted to address was the if they doubled the amount of items. I don't know if you were referring to doubling the amount of items we can purchase, as in we had 12 item slots instead of 6, or if you meant double the amount of choices, because I've gone through a couple videos now addressing removed items and how the point of that is to make the game feel less cluttered. It's nice to have a bunch of extra items just so that we can play around, just so we can have like fringe options. I'm still a big fan of Zephyr, I wish they brought it back. But the reason they took it out is because if you're a new player or a low level player and you're trying to figure out what's good on a champion, if there's too much selection, that can make things difficult for you to really pinpoint what the champion needs, how the champion excels, and it might shift away focus from that champion and more into items, which is what people, depending on what school of thought you're from, want or don't want. For me, I feel like more emphasis should be placed on the champion, not so much the items they purchase, instead of the other way around. A good example of this would be Spear Shojin. Some champions were made or broken by Spear Shojin, and I didn't like that, even though I abused Shojin a lot because I played Renekton and Jax and that stuff. Now on the other hand, if we're talking about double the amount of item slots, that's an interesting thought experiment that's been brought up many times. If we had a 7th item slot or an 8th item slot, more often than not, you will never reach full build. I would say 1 out of every 50 or 100 games do you actually reach full 6 items. Where that will matter more is in the realm of building components, because as you go through your 4th, 5th, and 6th item, you'll have less open slots to buy stuff. In doing so, that will delay your power spikes more incrementally, in that you can't just back at 35 minutes with 800 gold and buy a component. You would usually have to wait until you can buy the entire item in full, and that might be enough of a buffer for the enemy team to take advantage of the fact that you still haven't cashed in on however much more gold you have than them. Although I don't know how much a 7th or 8th item slot will actually matter in the long run. To reiterate though, it's all that's really going to do is just make it so that you can buy more components, but once again, there aren't that many opportunities where you're going to be reaching full build anyway. Okay, next one is from Archer Willems. The brief honeymoons after massive meta-disrupting updates such as the class reworks and the Season 11 item update create the most enjoyable times to play League. I agree and disagree. I don't want to be boring and say it depends, but it really actually just does depend. There are some times where I think throwing a wrench into everything makes the game very interesting in the sense that it eliminates stagnation and it kind of throws the entire meta for a loop. from my personal experience, I actually agree. There were a lot of instances where just a massive shakeup or a huge cascade of changes created some of the most enjoyable times to play the game. The Mythic Items, when they first came out, it was so much fun experimenting every champion. Since there were a whole bunch of new items, it was Gale Force, it was Proto Belt. Well, Proto Belt came out a long time ago. It was Gale Force, it was Stride Breaker back when it had the dash, it was Gore Drinker, there was Prowler's Claw. All of these different interactions that we never even thought was possible prior. Or the massive class system reworks like what they did with the Marksman update, then the Assassin update, the Mage update during seasons 5, 6, 7. That was awesome too. I kind of wish they brought that back actually, and they're sort of doing it, just more incrementally. They're doing the mid-scope updates. All the same, there were a few experiences where I really wish never happened, like again, Banner of Command, Ardent Sensor meta. Those are ancient history at this point, but you get what I mean. They set a precedent for what happens when you become too ambitious with things. And maybe if in the future they decide to do that again, I definitely noticed that Riot has become more conservative with preseason changes after the Mythics. Like Season 12's preseason was pretty bland aside from adding Hextech and Chemtech Drake. Otherwise, maybe if they incorporated some community feedback, like, you know how they have a video like lol please or like developer blog diary thingamadoohickey? If they announced the kind of changes that we're going to be doing in advance and kind of gave us a full detailed rundown of the contents of it, then maybe we could sort of form preliminary assumptions on how that would actually influence the meta. In which case, I do welcome more drastic changes. I know that for League, it lives and dies on its changes. On one hand, there are times where I wish there weren't so many buffs and nerfs and they just gave champions time to like settle down and figure out how the meta is. Well, not champions, the players. And other times I'm like, man, can they shake things up a bit? The game has been running kind of stale for a while. So it just depends on the mood or it depends on circumstance, but I do agree that sometimes just a massive shakeup can make the game really interesting, if only for a short while. Okay, we got 2 more to go. I'll try to do more in the future, it's just that I like to go in depth on every single hot take or these kinds of comments. I also just don't want the video to go too long. The most I'm willing to tolerate is about 15 to 20 minutes because that's most people's attention spans. I would love to do this for like an hour. Maybe I might do, you know what, maybe what I might do is a stream. I'll stream me reading through hot takes and then I guess I can have an editor take some of the interesting ones, kind of like a Q&A session. But moving on, this is from Sin the Tick Beast. I think Grievous Wounds should stack. That way it actually works better if you work as a team. Fix anti-heal problems for champs like Aatrox without making them irrelevant. There's a cost associated with getting better Grievous Wounds, but the payoff is better. That is a very interesting point. I fully agree with that. Now that I think about it, as someone who plays healing champions a lot, or as someone who is usually the first person to buy Grievous Wounds, and I scream at my team to build them, even though they don't, despite the enemy team having like Vladimir, Yuumi, and I don't know, Silas. Grievous Wounds has been a very hot point of contention. I just released the video on HP casters a while back, and I talked about how Grievous Wounds is so polarizing for the sheer fact that it isn't really done incrementally. It would be very interesting if we had multiple sources pile on a single person, because that way you can figure out, okay, healing is not that much of a problem right now, it's only a Yuumi, for example. Then we can have our support build Chemtech Putrefier, and then the rest of us will be fine. But if there's a rampant amount of healing on the enemy team, or if let's say there's a massive raid boss like Aatrox, then what we could do is if everyone were to stack Grievous Wounds, that would go from, let's say 20% all the way to 60%. They nerfed Grievous Wounds from 40-60 to 25-40 so that healing champions don't get screwed over that much, but there are many instances where you need 60% healing reduction, otherwise they'll just steamroll all over you. So perhaps that could be an interesting idea and one that incentivizes players to kind of collaborate together to shut down a dangerous opponent on the enemy team. If, let's say, the first instance of Grievous Wounds does 20%, and then subsequent applications of it are, let's say, 10% more, so it goes from 20, then 30, 40, 50, 60, that could be a cool way to kind of balance Grievous Wounds around. On the other hand, that runs the risk of healing becoming even more of an issue, right? Because Grievous Wound items are typically not gold efficient. You're paying a cost, like you said, there's a cost associated with getting better Grievous Wounds, but the payoff is better. Usually the payoff isn't. It's not as egregious as paying the QSS tax for like Malzahar, Skarner, or Warwick, but buying Grievous Wounds is usually not a good idea unless there's a critical mass of it on the enemy team, like Aatrox top, Jungle Hecarim, mid Silas, ADC, what's an ADC that heals a lot? Neela, and support Soraka. Then everyone purchasing Grievous Wounds is cost effective, but if it's just one person on the enemy team, you really don't want to dedicate too many resources to shut them down. but in some cases, that one person might be so overfed like a Dr. Mundo that it's obligatory for you to purchase it. So you're caught in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. In which case, if we were to go down this route of making it so you can stack multiple grievous wounds, some champions might be inadvertently more powerful than they really should be because the enemy team has to stack even more. It would be easier if one person purchased a grievous wounds item that applied 40% than requiring 3 people to buy grievous wounds items to get that 40%. Alternatively, if let's say you didn't have to purchase the final item, you didn't have to purchase Morello, Putrefier, Mortal Reminder, Thornmail, and just Executioner's Calling, Oblivion Orb, and Bramble Vest alone could still stack from 20 to 40%, then that would work. It's going to require some fine-tuning and a bit of experimentation, but I actually do agree with this change. Maybe this should be something that if a Riot employee is watching, suggested to the development team, and see how it goes. Alrighty, the final one. This is actually a ton of fun, by the way. I do want to do a part 2. I really hope this does well. I know I sound like a very, how do I say, a very greedy YouTuber and that, oh, I need views. But then again, who knows? For all my concerns, this might actually get, friggin' 100,000 views in 24 hours. I don't know. One last take is going to be from Chris Campbell. I think boot enchantments need to be brought back. Obviously, Home Guard was too good compared to the rest, but maybe Home Guards can stay its own thing and just have more options in the boot slot. So I think the reason why they removed boot enchantments back in, I think, Season 6 was not necessarily because of Home Guard. It was more just an extraneous thing. I do miss the Alacrity. I like Alacrity. There was also, I think, Furor. Furor gave you a kind of, what's it? It used to be Phage, but now it's a Hearthbound Axe type effect where on hit you would gain bonus movement speed. Those things are definitely nice. I don't think anyone would complain about not having them, but they're just not very creative. It's free stats at the end of the day. If they wanted to rework boot enchantments and make it so that they actually provide a special effect, like let's say, I don't know, I entertain the thought of boots building up a momentum type thing, kind of like Deadman's Plate, where if you like walk around a lot for a bit, your next attack will do something. Boots in general have been kind of meh, right? Like Swifty's boots doesn't feel good to build anymore, and even Mertrez has been falling off a bit. So it would be nice if there was more functionality to boots, or if you can upgrade your boots from an 1100 gold purchase to a finalized one. That would be interesting because most people want to sell them, right? If you're at 5-6 items, people want to sell them since they obviously don't provide the same amount of stats as a fully finished item. But losing that movement speed is so critical for certain champions. Some champions, they need that 45 movement speed or 55 movement speed to function and respond to enemy pressure. But I concur with that. I think there needs to be more of a, they should revisit the boot system and see if maybe, I don't know, by level 13 or 14, you can upgrade it to an item for 3,000 gold. Or we can try, who knows, a fusion system where you can combine half the stats of a finished legendary item into a boots. And that might open a Pandora's box of a whole bunch of balance problems, but just, something fun to try out because boots have been neglected, just like how I think the summoner spell system has been failing to withstand the test of time. And I actually was thinking about, I believe someone made a hot take on the changes to teleport in the early season 12 this year. So yeah, I think maybe for preseason 13, if they're interested, they can try to rework boots or add a new system or new tier of boots so that we can continue purchasing more items even after we finish our 5. It's also because the Mythic Item passive doesn't recognize boots as a finished item, rightfully so. And that's roughly all I have to say about that. Okay, so we made it to the end of the video. In hindsight, now that I've finished, I noticed that 4 out of 5 of the takes were related to items. Maybe I could have mixed them up a bit, but let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed this type of video, if you want me to make another one, and I'll try my best to incorporate a few hot takes that I don't agree with. I also noticed that the 5 that I chose were stuff that I kind of concurred with in some way, shape, or form, so I might choose one that I severely disagree with and we can bounce ideas in that sense. Just a reminder though that if you do want to see a part 2 and if let's say this part 1 does really well, feel free to share some hot takes of your own in the comments down below. They don't necessarily have to be hot takes or unpopular opinions. Some people might just have a very similar opinion that we all think would be, even though it's kind of risky to implement into the game, it would be interesting to see, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to be hot takes and stuff like that. Now that I say that, there was another comment from Knight of Magnolia who said the same thing. There's a system in Wild Rift that isn't part of Summoner's Rift, and that's having the boots be enchantment items. I think you would have the boots fill an actual niche in terms of items instead of simply having just one passive effect. So those two had basically similar wording in that the boots in League are kind of outdated and should be reworked. So just because someone shares an opinion as you or a few people share the same opinion doesn't necessarily mean it's not a hot take, it just means that maybe coincidentally a few of you had the same thought. So feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. For the time being, if you enjoyed this video, it would be awesome if you could leave a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter. You can also post some hot takes on Twitter as well. Join my Discord server, and if you're interested in supporting me further, check out my Patreon page, which is benefits for Vars, Vars 2 and Vars 3. Link is in the description. Till next time though, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.